I want to turn now and talk about two other stories. One, the next one related to this Trayvon Martin hoax, unbelievable incident that is just really kind of waking up a lot of American thought, as you were hearing from listening to the author. The Black Lives Matter movement sprang out of the Trayvon Martin hoax. The Trayvon Martin hoax that was perpetrated on the American people. And the Black Lives Matter movement, the main narrative of that movement is America is not safe for young black men. They may become random victims for no reason at all. They may end up, victims of police shootings unjustified. They may end up, just white people in the streets may end up hurting them and shooting them. This whole narrative of America as a deeply racist country was pounced on right after the Trayvon verdict came in, that George Zimmerman found not guilty. The Black Lives Matter grew and moved out of that case and this narrative that tries to paint America as deeply racist and hateful. And many Americans have been talking about it since that time. Many Americans reject the argument of these leftists. I love that Joel Gilbert pointed out that the reason, in great part, that the left got behind this, that the prosecutors wanted to go along, that the whole Obama administration wanted this, it fit their narrative, their determination to scare black Americans into thinking this country is filled with racists and the only way they can be safe is to continue to elect Democrats. It is a truly vicious and malicious and horrible hoax perpetrated on America. And so Black Lives Matter moved forward, funded, just so we're clear on this, by George Soros, who pretty much hates everything about America, funded by George Soros, and in many ways, not just Soros, but many of the tentacles and the snake-like connections of all these different organizations he funds, continue to perpetrate the Black Lives Matter narrative, continue to stir up racial suspicion and hatred and distrust of people. This is what the Black Lives Matter movement does. And it is so telling that on their website, it does. You'd think Black Lives Matter would be about, racial justice and standing up and urging re-examining of certain cases or urging laws that change. It's not. It's just a cabal of radical leftist ideas tossed onto a website called Black Lives Matter. They're into every left-wing agenda item you can imagine. But I want to focus in this segment, though, is on the impact of this Black Lives Matter movement springing out of the Trayvon Martin hoax. In Maryland, just this past weekend, I think it was on Friday, there was an incident at a fair. A lot of places have county fair and state fair. They had the Great Frederick Fair in Maryland this past Friday. At the Great Frederick Fair in Maryland, a 59-year-old man, last name of Weed, named John Weed, 59 years old, white guy, went to the fair with his family. At the fair, two young black men who are brothers, 15 and 16 years old, approached him, asked him for supposedly a dollar, and he said no. The older brother, the 16-year-old, punched John Weed in the back of his head, and as he's kind of reeling from that, and some short amount of time elapsed, then the 15-year-old brother charged this man, punched him in the gut really hard, caused him to fall over, and he later died the next day from his injuries. And I'm telling you this story to make a few points about how insidious the impact has been of the Trayvon Martin hoax and the Black Lives Matter movement. To start with, as soon as this incident occurred, of course, the police got involved, they investigated, they took statements from everybody. They found these two young men, and they are minors, so we don't even know their names. I don't even want to know their names. 15 and 16-year-old brothers, and they were arrested for beating on this guy. In fact, after they had killed him, he's on the ground, one or both of them was spitting in his face before they ran away. So this happened at this Frederick Fair, and the reason I raise this is this. The police have investigated. They've talked to every witness who was there that they can find. They have numerous people who actually filmed the incident on their cameras, have video of the incident, so they can see what happened. And they were arrested, of course, and they went before a judge. And these are two young men, these 15 and 16-year-old, went before a judge with the, facing serious charges, of course. Their parents, both parents of these two brothers, came to court, begged the judge to let the boys be released and come home, stay at home pending the actual indictment and the legal proceedings and the trial. Let them stay at home. These boys they're not high school dropouts. They live in this Maryland area. They attend public school. They're reported to have played sports at public school. These are not like homeless kids. These are kids with parents who care, who live in a home that has parents who provide for them, and they go to school. They have the community around them and the sports they play. But they engage in this conduct at the fair. They're alleged to have. And so that incident, horrible as it is, and I can tell you, of course I feel terrible for this family, of the victim, the 59-year-old dad or man who just shows up at the fair and ends up in this, ends up being killed because he wouldn't give $1 to someone who was asking him. I actually feel for the parents of these two boys because they probably thought of all the things their kids could be doing, things that could be troublemaking, things that might be dangerous. They wanted to go to the fair. The fair is, kind of wholesome entertainment. You can see the animals, go on the rides. That's what their boys chose to do. However, this incident occurred, and here we sit. The judge would not release these two. But I get around to this story and the hideous and insidious impact of Black Lives Matter and the Trayvon Martin hoax. As soon as this story came out, there were stories out on the internet, videos out on the internet, tweets out on the internet, claiming that the incident actually involved a white supremacist who had been taunting the boys and threatened the boys, and the boys, in self-defense, because they were afraid for their lives, beat up on or punched the guy and ended up. And by the way, the police have acknowledged that as soon as these two boys were arrested, they expressed shock and truly seemed sad that this man had died. They didn't shoot him; they just punched him. They were shocked that he had passed on. But the point is, almost immediately after this story, a guy who has a Twitter handle in which he, in Twitter, you tell him who you are. He lists that he's a race baiter. He put a story out on the internet that these two boys were not actually, in trouble for legitimate reasons, that actually the victim, the white guy, who hadn't done anything, there's video, you can see he did nothing. He was a white supremacist. He was screaming racial epithets at them, and out of fear and for their lives and fear for their safety, they got aggressive and punched the guy. As it turned out, they're very sorry he passed on. But basically, they're trying to make the point that this entirely was the fault of the white guy. And so they put a tweet out, and this guy went wild on Twitter. The tweet claiming that the white guy was a white supremacist who was an aggressor, got like 200,000 views. I think it was finally taken down because there's nothing to it. But people trying to write about it have been going to this author and saying, "Where'd you get that idea?" In fact, in his story, the race baiter story, he's saying, "Oh yeah, witnesses were saying, this white guy was a white supremacist and he was the aggressor and it's all his fault." So these newspaper people go back to him and they say, "Who are you talking about? Who are the witnesses? Name the witnesses." And he won't, because they aren't there. And I'm getting at this to say, this Trayvon Martin thing planted the seed in the minds of so many people that it's okay to concoct stories of white supremacism. It's okay to make up things that aren't true, that the probable narrative really is somehow these young men who were involved in this were somehow the victims, and that the white guy was somehow this horrific white supremacist. It's okay to make things up because the underlying narrative of the Black Lives Matter, they claim, must be true. This is a terrible country. And so I raised this story. I don't know this family. I don't know these kids. I don't know if these young teenagers, though, who engage in this conduct at the fair, they've been raised in a time when, since the Trayvon Martin case happened, you have leftists all over this country, including the former president, urging people to think of this country as a deeply racist place where you must fear for your life at all times, where there's a racist around every corner. This whole white supremacist, racist country thing, narrative, started with Trayvon, started with Black Lives Matter, and it's just wormed its way into so many stories, so many lives. It's been a horrific impact on young Americans. This whole story has been, it is not a crime, it's not a victimless crime. This concoction and elevation and exaggeration of the problem of racism in this country has true victims, and the people mostly victims are young black Americans who actually live their life in fear thinking this is true. And it ties back, we talked about yesterday, where we had the extremely, or whatever day it was, the extremely wonderful testimony of Candace Owens in front of the Congress saying that pointing out again, the Democrats raise this racist narrative every 4 years in an election cycle, every 4 years to scare black voters into thinking that the country is rife with racism and the only protection they possibly have is to vote for Democrats. And Candace Owens called them out on it. This film, the Trayvon film, calls them out on it, and you should call them out too.